So maybe you're a student, you're coming to the end of your core exams, maybe you've just reached the associate level qualification, maybe you're an apprentice maybe, and you're thinking about going on to fellowship, or maybe you're just curious and this is just something you might be interested in having a look at. But today we're going to talk about the later actuarial exams. And what I mean by that is the stuff that follows after your core exams, so specialist exams, all the stuff that starts with an S. And also included in this list will be the big CP1 actuarial practice exam as well. So I have a very special guest to help me talk about this today. This is Lindsay. Could you take a moment, Lindsay, please, to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Lindsay. I'm a life insurance actuary by trade. Worked in industry, insurance companies and in consultancy for many years. I've been in education now about 15 years or so. I teach the life insurance subjects, also CP1 and CP3. So definitely up at the higher end of the examination scale.
Fabulous, thanks. You're absolutely perfect for this video, aren't you, Lindsay? It's exactly who we need. So I'm at the other end, right? All the stuff I teach is early subject
the bottom
stuff.
End.
Yeah, the bottom end. Yeah. The chronologically bottom end, right? I don't know. They have their different challenges, and of course we've got another video on that topic as well. Of course, I have been through the later exams myself, so I've got a broad idea of the things that Lindsay might be suggesting here. But that's not been for a few years. So the first thing I think it'd be really nice to focus on is just these broad differences. So they aren't the same thing, are they, the early exams and the later exams? How would you, what major differences would you highlight between the early exams and the later exams?
I guess probably the main difference is fundamentally words. So you may, in the earlier subjects, you're maybe doing some shortish, wordy answers to it. There'll be multiple choice questions. And of course, there's going to be lots of calculations. In the later subjects, there may be some calculations in there. It will depend on the subject, but a significantly higher proportion of wordy answers. And some can actually be for quite a large number of marks, 10 to 15 marks, or even more for a single question part. And there's probably a bit more of a focus in these later subjects on the wider application and what we call higher order skills. You're given a scenario, you're asked about problems or issues that might arise in that scenario, or maybe the actions that might be taken in a particular situation. So it's a different kind of application in these subjects.
Fabulous. Yeah, I mean, there is the idea of higher order skills. It does come up in the earlier exams too, but I guess what we're saying here is that gets developed quite dramatically, doesn't it, for the later exams? So that becomes the focus of the exam rather than just say 20% of your mark. I think it would be for some of the early exams. So when you're taking the exam, what sorts of things are the examiners going to be looking for and scoring highly for those later subjects?
Well, one of the things that we find that students struggle with is making sure they've got enough breadth of ideas in their answers. Where you've got these question parts with a reasonable number of marks, what you need to be doing is to aim to cover as wide a range of different areas, valid areas of course, as you possibly can, rather than just taking one or two aspects and drilling down and down into those areas. It's really important to get this breadth in, but you still may need to add that depth in as well if the command verb indicates that it's appropriate to do so. Say you've got a discuss or an explain question, say, and there are enough marks available as well to encourage you to put that depth in. So in these later subjects, fundamentally, we're still looking for breadth of ideas, but you may also need to add a bit more depth in depending on the question. And in terms of these command verbs, would definitely recommend having the list of the IFOA's command verbs and their definitions next to you during the exam as part of your reference materials, because there are loads and loads of different command verbs that do get used in these later exams, ones that you perhaps wouldn't have met in some of the earlier subjects. And it's just useful to have that list there as part of your reference material. And I think the other aspect to want to watch out for very carefully in these later exams is tailoring your answers to the particular scenario in the question. It's something that examiners' reports often say students aren't doing enough of. Now, that doesn't mean that every single point you make has to be tailored into the scenario where one is given, but try and do as much as you absolutely can. And you'll see, for example, in CP1 paper 2, which is quite heavily scenario based, you get given background information about a particular context, and then you're asked lots of questions running from that. So being able to adapt your answers, filter your points and adapt them to the specifics of the scenario given is a really important skill to develop and then use in these later exams.
Fabulous. So there's a lot of information there, wasn't there? I think just to summarize, so I think the important thing that you're stressing there is that breadth is really, really important, breadth of knowledge, I guess. But when you're coming to actually answer your questions, you're going to have to somehow whittle that down to what's specific to the particular scenario to make sure that you're homing in on exactly what it is that the examiners are looking for.
Yeah,
hopefully I've described that about right. That okay? No, that's really, really interesting.
Go broad,
yeah,
but tailor.
Yeah, start broad and then filter, isn't it? So when you find yourself on sitting there on exam day, staring at a question, these are the sorts of questions I always warn my students about. The worst ones is it's one sentence and it's worth like 10 marks, 15 marks or something like this, isn't it? That's the sort of thing to make you stop and think. What sort of recommendations would you have when you're met with a question like that? What sort of exam techniques would you use in that circumstance?
The absolute first thing to do, really importantly, maybe it's too obvious to say, but not everybody will do it, is really, really careful question reading. So careful reading of all of the information that you're told about before you reach that one-liner. A lot of people use underlining and highlighting to pick out keywords and phrases within that information. If you do that, just be a little bit careful. It's a good technique to help you see those big ideas in there, but just be a little bit careful when you go back and reread the scenario and the information in the question, which you do need to do several times. Make sure you're not only reading the stuff you've highlighted or underlined, because you might have missed something important. So make sure you read everything, and then look very carefully at what you're being instructed to do. Read all of it, every single word, very carefully. Try not to frame a question in your head. Make sure you are doing exactly what they're saying you. Again, it seems really obvious, but people do trip up on this quite a lot. Quite often students will read a question and vaguely it will look a little bit familiar to a question that might have come up before, and then we'll give the answer to the question that came up before when it is not quite the same question. So be very, very careful with your question reading. What I'd recommend you do then is think a little bit about structuring. Can you break that question down, that one-liner, or two-liners, however many it is, can it be broken down into smaller chunks to make it easier for yourself, make it less daunting, and give a little bit of structure around your answer? Then think to yourself, okay, which part or parts, plural, of the course can I use to help me come up with ideas for this question? Because quite often in these later subjects, the examiners are actually asking or requiring us to put together different parts of the course within the same question part. So try not to narrow down too quickly. Try not to look at the question and go, oh, I see where that comes from, because perhaps other things can help with it as well. So think about, what can I use from the course? Look at all the details and the information that you've got in the scenario and the question. What is there? What clues are there as to what you could be talking about and writing about? What do you need to filter out of all the bookwork that isn't going to be relevant to that? But for these later subjects, particularly for these higher mark question parts that you've mentioned, you also potentially need to lean on wider idea generation techniques. For example, you might need to think about different stakeholders. What are their angles and perspectives in a particular situation? The tutorials that we run, they help you to develop and practice these sort of additional idea generation techniques. Our asset products as well, there's lots of information there and advice and help on the ways in which you can generate ideas for each of these past exam questions.
Yeah, it sounds like the skills you need, or the approaches you need for these later exams, they're going to be not worlds apart, I guess, from early exams, but there's a subtle difference there. There's a subtle distinction. I think one thing that I would focus on, I think, just to reiterate, is the importance of linking together different parts of the course. I suspect in a lot of the early subjects, certainly the ones that I teach, you can identify the bit of the course that's being examined. You can just focus on that bit of the course and you can answer the entire question just thinking about that one bit of the course. But when you've got to think more broadly, when you've got to get a nice wide array of ideas, you might have to link together different parts of the course. You might have to think more widely across different aspects of the course. And I guess that's a different skill, isn't it? It's a fundamentally different skill.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think one other thing to repeat here, I guess, funnily enough, is one thing that I always remember from taking these exams. This is what you said right at the beginning of your answer there. Read the question again, sketch out an answer, read the question again, maybe think a little bit more, read the question again. But the danger isn't it, is that you can kind of answer the question that you want to see rather than the one that's actually been given to you by the examiners. And I think the danger of that in the later exams, firstly, the consequences are greater, aren't they? Because there's more marks. But also, I guess it's probably easier to accidentally go down that route than it is with some of the earlier exams. Yeah, really, really good advice.
It's also really important to think about how you write your answers as well. So sometimes people go into these later subjects and think they have to write full sentences, paragraphs, nice sort of like SAE type answers, English comprehension type answers. Absolutely not. Keep with the bullet points. You need to use time efficiently in that exam. They are time pressured exams. Get your idea and just get it down nice and concise, succinctly. Here's an idea, here's an idea, here's an idea. You just have to write enough for the markers to appreciate that you get that point. And keep thinking in half marks as well. If you've got, although this sounds daunting, if you've got a 10-mark question, think to yourself, I really need to try and target saying 20 things if I possibly can, 20 distinct things. When you look at the examiner's reports, you'll see that they give whole marks for some points. But quite often there's a lot going on in that point where they're giving a whole mark to, maybe a couple of things going on. So it's not the best strategy to go in there with is a half mark mentality for how many ideas that you need to generate in there. And also try and be very clear and precise with your answer points if at all possible. Woolly statements are the sorts of things that may or may not get credit in the exam. Quite often people say there's quite a significant discrepancy, say, between their first marker and their second marker. Well, that could well be because the points being made are just a little bit on the fluffy side, a bit woolly. One marker might give you the benefit of the doubt, another one might not. Try and make sure your answer points are as clear, precise as they possibly can be, and then every marker is going to give you the credit, and that's going to help you get over the pass line. So for example, rather than saying that in a particular situation something might change, bit vague, if you could say it's more likely to increase, say, that's much more likely to nail you that half mark. And what I'd say overall in terms of tackling these questions for these later subjects, just make sure you have done absolutely loads and loads and loads of question practice just to get the hang of how questions are worded and what the examiners want you to do according to the way that they've worded those questions. There's nothing to beat that question practice and getting familiar with the way they're asked and the way the answers should be being developed and presented.
Yeah, fabulous. One more quick question for you before we finish. A little bit of advice. I wonder if you have any advice for a subset of students who might be coming to this video interested in these later subjects, and that's people with exemptions. So there might be people who, for instance, if they've gone through an actuarial science degree or something like this, they might have a lot of exemptions from the early subjects. So they might not have had that same development through the actuarial exam structure, and they may find that they're coming to these later exams having not done a huge number of prior exams or certainly ones that were set by the IFOA. Do you have any advice for those candidates, for those students?
Yeah, agreed. It's tougher. It's tougher to come into these later subjects when you haven't been through the system of the earlier ones, because inevitably you may just simply not have the same familiarity with terms used within whatever specialism area that you're working in, because you just haven't had the same length of experience in the working environment. Some of the concepts that others with more experience, they'll be able to understand those concepts more quickly. So you just have to basically allow a bit more time when you're studying to think about and absorb those sorts of ideas. People who have got experience within industry, they're not going to have experience across all of the possible areas that could get tested. So they're also going to struggle with terminology and concepts and ideas in parts of the course. It's just that if you have got limited experience in industry, then you're just going to have to spend a little bit more time possibly thinking about the ideas and digesting them. And of course, just making sure you do what I mentioned just now, that loads and loads of question practice. So you get used to those different sort of exam styles, the questioning styles that are used by the IFOA compared to what you may have been used to in the university environment.
Yeah, I guess one thing we've touched on this already, we've not really talked about it too explicitly, but that's tutorials. I guess if you are in that situation, if you do show up to tutorials, I guess in particular, I guess face-to-face tutorials might be particularly important for someone in this situation. You're going to expose yourself to other people who've got, 5-6 years maybe experience working that in industry, and you'll have an opportunity to bounce ideas off them as well.
But not literally expose yourself.
No, that's right. Expose yourself in a figurative sense. Yeah. To help you get in an intellectual sense. Yeah, I like that. Yeah. So that might be another thing to think about. I guess it might make tutorials more important because it gives you that exposure, doesn't it? It gives you face-to-face contact with people who maybe have got that experience that I guess is potentially your weakness if you've come very recently out of university.
Indeed. And I think for the later subjects in the tutorials, we tend to have a little bit more of a discursive sort of arrangement. Because there aren't really right or wrong answers as such, or rather there isn't a single right answer to the question.
Yeah, there are wrong answers, aren't there?
there are wrong answers.
Yeah. There's no getting away from that.
Some answers point some more right than others. But there's a little bit more, there's much more maybe about the sort of answer points. Well, maybe this would work or maybe that wouldn't work in a particular situation. So the tutorials, we probably do more group work, group discussions, working in pairs, for example, and learning from each other a little bit more than you would if you were, say, doing mathematical questions in the tutorial.
Yeah, fantastic. Brilliant. Now, that's been a really, really interesting conversation. I've learned a lot. Certainly with my general exposure to the early exams up to now, so it's nice to think about those exams, get a little bit of reminder of what they were like and what that process was like. Thank you so much for your time, Lindsay. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. So it's goodbye from me, goodbye from us, I guess, Lindsay, and we'll see you all next time for another episode of Tutor Talk.